So it's great to have Paul with us today. Paul works at Theos. He's also a church leader, I think, in Greenwich as well, in that area. And so, Paul, hand over to you about the research from Religious London.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you all this morning. I appreciate it. We launched this report in June, but we actually intended to launch it on the 23rd of March, which, if you recall, is the day we went into the first national lockdown. It's been in the works for about 2 years. London was going to have a big year in 2020. It was going to have a forward-looking mayoral election. It's been 20 years since the founding of the Mayoral Assembly and the Assembly and the Mayoralty. It was going to be one of those opportunities, I think, to think about the life of the city in general, the well-being of the city, the future of the city. Little did we know everything that was going to happen, and I feel like London faces now some challenges that we couldn't have imagined a year ago. But we hope this report continues to be of use. What I'll do today is just really rush through some of the data that we collected. It is fascinating, and there's a lot. There is a lot we could talk about, and I'll be guided by you in the Q&A and opportunities for you to ask questions. I hope, and if there's anything you're interested in that I can answer, I really hope that I'll be able to help. A little bit about Theos. We're a think tank. We were launched in 2006. Our brief was really to change the climate of opinion around religion and belief in society. We wanted to offer an informed voice at a time when there were lots of voices, but they were strident and aggressive. I think Richard Dawkins had just released The God Delusion in 2006 and was shoveling copies out of the door by the million. I think it sold about 5 million copies now, obviously influencing the public conversation in a very real way. And we were set up partly in response to some of those narratives. We wanted to tell a better story about the church and its role in public life. So, Religious London, I'm going to try and share some. Andy, could you enable me to share some slides? Actually, it's a PDF, so that's probably the best way to go about it. I've bounced this on Andy. He's frantically looking for the right setting, but I'll just begin instead. Why this piece of work? We were thinking very much a few years ago. Really, we had had a couple of events with particularly one guy, a secular Jew called Ben Judah, who had written a book, which perhaps some of you will have come across, which is called This Is London. And it was a sort of Orwellian journey into London's underbelly. One of the interesting things for me, and one of the things that I read it because I live in London and I was interested. But it was really fascinating how a lot of the stories he was uncovering were about religion and religious identity and religious practice. I think that surprised him. We had an event with him here, and we were encouraged and sort of came up with a plan to look at some of this stuff. And it's also been well known in some of the sort of data sets that are available that London, because patterns of migration largely, but it's quite a surprising city in terms of some of its social values. Differs from some of the rest of the country. And so we wanted to look more at that, look more intentionally, and really explore the question on the back of what we knew had been decades of increased church-based and faith-based social action, how that was working out in a particular context in the capital. So here we go. Andy's saved the day, and I can now share this. So the first thing to say is that London is just proportionately more religious than the rest of the country. So 62% of people in London say that they have a religious belief or identity, and that compares to only 53% in the rest of the UK. Obviously, London is more plural, it's more diverse than the rest of the country as well, and lots of levels. We'll look a little bit about that in a minute. But you will see here that although the proportion of Londoners who say they are Christian is lower than the rest of the country, the overall proportion of people who say they're religious is higher than the rest of the country. I don't know if that's a surprise to you or not a surprise to you. We've had both those reactions, both extremes of people saying, yeah, of course. And then people say, are you joking? Where did you get this idea from? And also the proportion of the non-religious, the proportion of people in London who say they're non-religious is much lower than the rest of the country. Skip on to the next slide. An important thing to say here is, so London is more religious in two senses. Firstly, it's more religious by proportion, but then it's more religious by intensity of religious engagement. So in the data that we collected with Savanta Comres, who are a polling agency, we asked questions on frequency of attendance, frequency of prayer, and use those to create a profile, or several profiles more to the point. The never practicing, the infrequently practicing, and the frequently practicing. So this is looking specifically at Christians, and you can see that the level of never practicing Christian, the NP category, in the rest of the country, the rest of GB, excluding London and also excluding Northern Ireland, just side note, but in the rest of the country, there are 54% of people say they're Christians. 54% of the people who say they're Christians never do anything about it, say almost never pray, almost never attend a religious service, whereas the comparable figure in London is 30%. Then on the infrequently practicing category, are about the same, 14% to 11% in London. But in the frequently practicing category, i.e. those Christians who say that they're attending more than once a month, we can talk about whether that's the right threshold or not, and praying, I think, at least every 2 weeks, if I remember how we drew that category. 30% of Christians in London are frequently practicing, compared to only about 1 in 10 Christians in the rest of the country, or people who say they're Christians. So there's a real divergence there between people who hold an identity and then people who are engaging in corporate acts and personal acts of worship. I don't put it like that. So let me move on to the next slide. We also, as part of our research, wanted to explore what were known to be different social and political views on in London, that again compared to the rest of the country. You will be aware that in the last 30, 40 years, the country has become significantly more socially liberal on so-called moral questions. London would usually have been perceived to be at the heart of that. London would also be perceived to be politically further to the left, which is kind of basically true. But we wanted to explore all of these questions, or a series of these questions, and really understand how religious groups sat within that. So I'll run through these very quickly, and we can talk about them more later if anybody wants to dig deeper, but we asked questions around political views, welfare views, and then questions around the role of the state or political authority, or authoritarianism versus libertarianism. So three categories to begin with. This is a table on the political differences. So we see we post statements like big businesses generally benefit owners at the expense of workers. So this is a stock kind of social research question. It aims to tease out people's views on whether they're kind of pro-business or pro-worker. You see the percentage of people agreeing with that across London is 77%, Christians slightly lower, others the same. This is not showing a particularly interesting difference. There's no particular divergence. But if you look at the non-category there, the non-religious, you see that they agree to a slightly greater proportion with a statement like that. But I've highlighted one of the statements here because I think that does show an interesting divergence. And that's the best way to tackle poverty is by generating wealth through strong business and private enterprise. Again, teasing at that pro-business or pro-state view. Or pro-welfare view. And we do see there a fairly significant difference between Londoners as a whole, and then Christian Londoners and other Londoners, other religious, that other categories, other religious, by the way. So total Londoners, 53% agreed with that statement. That's still quite high, higher than I would have expected in London, but it commands more agreement amongst Christian groups, 61%, 61% against the other religious groups. What we were interested here also is to explore the implications of our never practicing, infrequently practicing, and frequently practicing categories. You can see those at the end, but on this statement, it didn't happen to make much of a difference. But there is a little bit of a divergence on these political questions between London's religious and non-religious communities. This is the question of welfare. So these are statements around broadly grouped around the provision of welfare. So you see the first one there: people shouldn't rely on the welfare state, and you see that commanded a relatively high agreement amongst a group like the never practicing Christians. There's something interesting happening there. But the one I really wanted to highlight to you is the government should provide for all vulnerable people by increasing taxes. What we're looking at there is again, I'm surprised by the high level of agreement amongst all Londoners here. So 48% of Londoners agreeing with that statement. Slightly lower percent of Christians, but then a significantly lower percent of other religious groups agree with that statement. So only 39% of people who identify as belonging to another religion agree with that statement. And there's something there about community solidarity, about mutual structures of care, not necessarily trusting the state to be the provider or the group that secures people's welfare. Basically, people relying on each other more than they necessarily rely on the state. So that was an interesting thing there. I was also interested here by the never practicing, infrequently practicing, and frequently practicing groups here. So the group that agreed most with this statement, that the government should provide for all vulnerable people by increasing taxes, was the frequently practicing Christian group. So that's 53% of frequently practicing Christians agree with that. I don't know how you feel about that. You might feel like, that's high, or that's not high enough. But we can talk about that later. So then finally, on these political questions, the libertarian, authoritarian things, these were where we saw significant divergence. You see I've highlighted 3 of our statements here. Schools should teach children to obey authority. Again, that's commanding a high agreement across London as a whole, 70%. But if you go to the frequently practicing Christian group, it's 84%. The religious nons, the people who say they have no religious identity, it's only 56%. So we're seeing a really radical divergence there between religious and non-religious in London. I highlighted the other 2 groups because I think it demonstrates that it's not just a matter that religious people are authoritarian and non-religious people are less authoritarian. It really depends on the issue. So if you look at something like government should get involved in people's lives to prevent environmentally harmful behaviour, so that's the penultimate statement on the table there. Governments should make environmentally harmful habits more expensive for citizens. You saw religious nons agreeing there to a very, very significant degree, 78%, and that indeed is the highest agreement of our different categories. So it's very important that we say it's not that religious people just want to control everybody's behaviour. We all want to control people's behaviour when it comes to an issue or another. Even if you're non-religious, you want to control people's behaviour when it comes to some of your most important priority issues. And then the final one, political correctness has gone too far. This was a rather pokey statement that we just threw in there, but I think it shows something really interesting. And again, I want to draw your attention to the non-practicing Christian category, the NP category. The level of agreement there is huge, and there is something about a kind of a received Christian identity, a sort of, if I could call it, a sort of traditionalism, a sort of broad cultural conservatism. And on a statement like this, there is a massive divergence between the non-practicing Christian category. So these are people who say that they're Christians, but don't necessarily go to church, don't necessarily have any kind of life in community or discipleship, but they are agreeing very strongly with the same. So it means something. Their Christian identity means something politically, rather than, it means actually more politically than it does in terms of their personal religious practice, something like that. Let's skip on. This is again very fascinating, and this is one of the things that we got a lot of coverage for when the report was launched, because it shows that London is more socially conservative than the rest of the country, and this is a factor of its religiosity. So I won't go through these exhaustively, but let's take, for example, the question of sex before marriage. Relatively non-controversial these days. So we asked people whether they, again, these are kind of stock social policy questions, social survey questions. We didn't invent them, they're asked by lots of other people, but we were looking particularly at the religious dynamic. So we asked people about whether these things were always wrong, mostly wrong, or never wrong, or only infrequently wrong. So the percentage you see here, the numbers you see here, are the percentage that said these things were at least sometimes wrong. So in the nation as a whole, only 13% of people said sex before marriage is at least sometimes wrong. In London, it was 24% of people saying sex before marriage is at least sometimes wrong. So what do we know from that? We know that London is more socially conservative. We're not saying it is socially conservative full stop, but it is by comparison more socially conservative than the rest of the country. And this is played out across the different issues that we asked people about, with exceptions that I have included here on marital infidelity. Yes, so we have a significantly, well, it's a surprising thing, isn't it? Because we think that London is the heart of the kind of progressive, socially liberal elite, but actually it tells a very different story about what London is, and this is about London's religiosity. So we can see that we've broken down those same questions by religious affiliation. So the nons, the red columns, are far less socially conservative than the Christians, the blue column, and the other religious people. That other religious column, by the way, in London is mainly made up of the Muslim community. So that social conservatism is that is a religious fact. We haven't done what's technically called a regression analysis, but I think that's clear enough. We don't need to see, but we don't need that to observe the correlation here. Here we have a graph which basically what we did was kind of score religious conservatism across a range of questions and averaged it across the different categories, and we see that the most socially conservative group is the frequently practicing Christian. The least socially conservative group is the religious non. But you see actually that on social questions, so we're not thinking about political questions here, but we're thinking about social morality, if you like, the infrequently and never practicing Christians gravitate towards the less socially conservative end of the spectrum. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, it's just an observation. Moving on, because there was a whole other wing of the research which I think is probably more relevant to your conversation today, and certainly I think it's really important. Is less sort of eye-catching and newsworthy, but very important nonetheless. So we looked at all sorts of indications of civil engagement in London and found that religiosity did correlate with higher civic engagement. Those are things like volunteering, joining a political party, or making a financial donation to a charitable cause. And we see across those three issues that the most civically engaged are frequently practicing Christians, which is fascinating. Generally speaking, there was a trend for other religious groups to be more socially engaged than religious nons. That's not as consistent, but it is clear. And of course, the least civically engaged are the religious nons, according to our statistics now. There's lots of reasons why that might be the case. I think critics of a study like this would say, but then people count their going to church as a form of civic engagement, or their volunteering for church as a form of civic engagement. I would say, yes, absolutely they do, and that's very right. But there's lots of things that might be underpinning this, but I think the correlation again is pretty clear. But in terms of getting involved in communities, loving neighbours, serving people in need, then there is a correlation between not just religious identity but religious practice. So it's the frequently practicing group that is the most engaged there. But we also observed a degree of, if I can call it, civic discomfort. So we asked a couple of questions about, these are things that, again, lots of social surveys trying to uncover about social trust, whether people know their local political representatives or feel that they can contact them and get some kind of redress if they've got a problem, or talk to them about an issue that they want to push ahead on. And generally speaking, there wasn't much to call between the kind of religious people in London and the non-religious people in London. But on a couple of these statements, we did find a significant difference and divergence. So we asked, for instance, we put a statement, for instance, governments have passed legislation that makes life for people, makes life difficult for people with beliefs like mine. You see there significant rates of agreement amongst various religious groups, most so the Muslim groups. So 54% of Muslims, who, by the way, the reason we haven't pulled out Muslims in the majority of this stuff is it does come just below the threshold of an individual category we should be reporting. So generally we've reported that in the other religion category. But it was interesting on this one to kind of separate out Muslim respondents. And 54% of Muslims say that governments have passed legislation that makes life difficult for people with beliefs like mine. 28% of Christians agree with that as well. That also increases by again intensity of engagement. And the two sets of columns that we have at the end there, they relate to regularity of attendance. So you're more likely to agree with a statement like this if you're a religious person that practices their faith frequently, in other words. So 46% of regular attenders agree that governments have passed legislation that makes life difficult for people with beliefs like mine. And then the yellow column relates to the statement, experience feeling marginalized or threatened because of my religious background, beliefs or identity. And again, the Muslim response for that is huge. Obviously, I think it's just really important to know that for people that share space, for as a church leader, I want to know that my Muslim neighbours feel like that. But Christians also agree in quite substantial numbers with that. 23% of Christians, and again, it is felt more strongly the more intensely you practice your faith. I just thought I'd throw this in at the end. There was at the beginning of the pandemic some discussion about there is continuing discussion about how the pandemic is affecting different religious groups to a different degree. I don't think enough work has been done on this, but I thought it was relevant for the discussion. I think you will want to be thinking and talking a lot about how do we make sense of the present moment, the present context, where a lot of the tools for our community engagement, I experienced this as a church leader, a lot of the tools, a lot of the kind of go-to methods, the things that we would ordinarily do, which are relational, they're about drawing people together, they're about kind of crossing boundaries, they're about showing hospitality. All those things are deeply, deeply problematized. But I thought it might just be worth reminding that there might be particular religious groups in your context that are more adversely affected by the pandemic than some. So what this data does from the ONS, Office for National Statistics, is it treats Christians as a kind of as the kind of baseline, and says, well, which religious groups are affected more or less than Christians and the two separate graphs there are for male and female. And you see that Muslim, Hindu, Jewish and Sikh people are having a worse time of it, or at least they were at this stage, and this is May, than Christians. And then there are people of no religious affiliation faring better. So there's something interesting there, I think, and it relates to the way in which religion exists at an intersection, not just of kind of all sorts of social and political values, but also of kind of deprivation, also of citizenship and a sense of being engaged. I just thought I'd show you that as a bit of maybe a provocation for your conversations. When we talked to people in various areas of London about how religious communities work or do not work well, with local political authorities, so your kind of local public authorities. We interviewed some religious leaders, we interviewed some people who are working for local councils, we interviewed people who are working for police, the Met Police, we interviewed people working for kind of fire and civil contingency, kind of in those kind of spaces. And we were, as part of this research, and I encourage you to dig deeper because I really ought to stop talking, we're uncovering all sorts of interesting things, things that helped people work together and things that were seeming to block conversation and block partnership and collaboration. Among those were one of the very interesting issues, of course, and probably one that you're coming across already, is the number of often diaspora religious congregations that are meeting in unlicensed premises. So that's really a really crunchy issue to do with planning, and it troubles local authorities, and they're thinking, well, they're not thinking hard enough about it, in my opinion, but some of them are certainly thinking about it. That, again, as I say, it's like, well, that's another thing that's moved on because nobody can go anywhere to meet, so it doesn't really matter. But there is something about the spaces that is available, or the space that is available for what are kind of growing and morphing and changing religious communities across the capital. Do they have the public spaces available for them to kind of conduct their basic kind of worshipping life? Other things that were coming up were the sort of age-old issues around sexuality. We had a little bit of a spike, if I can use that phrase, of interviews that brought up the issue of sex education in schools, and that contributing to that general sense of being shut out of the public conversation, or being left to the side when assumptions were moving on, or values were moving on. But overall, what we found is, of course, and you will know this, there is a lot of working with and working alongside, and there is a lot of something that would be could qualify for the term partnership between faith groups and local authorities. There is a lot of opportunities that are missed. And sometimes faith groups are ahead of state providers on issues. I think you saw that writ large around the Grenfell disaster. But our big argument here is it's just all too organic. That's what we would say. It's too accidental, it's too random, there isn't enough consistent practice. It relies on individuals, their relationships, whether they're good or bad. It kind of comes and goes. And that's happened quite interestingly. A couple of the boroughs we were looking at, there was a sense that there were points of where it was really working well, but then a couple of people moved on, and suddenly everything sort of seized up. So there's too much randomness. There's too much. It's very unpredictable. And so positively, you could say that that's a dynamic of a sort of relational level of engagement. I think the truth is that more often it's just being left to chance. And the other thing that happens is that there tends to be kind of conversation therefore tends to crystallize around urgent problems. So whether that's a terrorist attack, or a civil disaster like Grenfell, that's when local authorities tend to sort of come out and start talking to faith groups. I would say that's not the best approach, because that means that it's always focused around problems, particularly for the Muslim community. That's quite difficult, because suddenly the local chief of police comes knocking when there's been a terrorist attack, and that's if you only as pastors and church leaders, you will recognise the difficulty of only talking to people when there's a problem, and that you need a kind of wider horizon and a wider relationship of trust on which to respond to challenge and respond to problems. So we want to find ways of creating conversation about making that a bit more consistent, and there are some models available that you may be aware of. The Faith Actions Covenant, which I don't think that many local authorities in London have signed, but that would be one way in which you could kind of solidify conversation and partnership between faith and public sectors. But again, something else for further discussion. At the end of it, we just want to say, look, London needs to take its religious life seriously, and London's leaders need to take its religious life seriously. And that's at the kind of mayor citywide level, but also at the local level as well. I was still surprised by the fair number of people we interviewed who seemed to be operating on an assumption that faith was just kind of gradually disappearing and churches were getting smaller, and some churches are getting smaller. But there was just a kind of, there was still that sense of a sort of secularization narrative that was in the minds of most, not most, that's unfair, but many interviewees from local authorities, but also some very enlightened and thoughtful counterexamples. But we want to encourage London's leaders, civic leaders, to engage seriously with the religious life of their communities. We think that there's something here to be done, some work to be done for religious groups, and it's around how the coordination question, and of course you guys are actively trying to do that, so preaching to the choir, but there is a lot of activity that again just passes under the radar because it's this church doing one thing and that church doing another, and really that makes it very complex dynamic for those same public leaders, whether in a local authority or in a police setting or fire or whoever, to understand and to navigate the arena. So there's a job of work for religious groups there to do in terms of working together and sending a kind of clear signal about where they are and a focus of activity. And then finally, we wanted to kind of encourage people to tackle what looked like a big burgeoning problem actually on the level of public space for faith groups. That might change in the future. I don't know any more than you guys about London's post-COVID future. This city may change radically in the next decade in a completely unexpected way. One of the, and I'll finish with this, London's population declined hugely from the end of the Second World War until the early 90s. In the early 90s, it began to increase. It only passed its end of Second World War peak in 2018. So it's just past its peak population, which previously experienced in 1945. So those big sort of societal shifting moments can change a city like London. We've become used to a kind of time of ever growing, ever intensifying, ever more frantic and frenetic sort of common life. That may change, and it may change the future and the fortunes of religious groups too.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul.